I kind of just wanted to chat with you a little bit about the cool stuff that
I'm
you're.
gonna let my COVID hairs go.
Oh, absolutely! I got the same thing going on, man. I've got almost enough for a man bun, so that's the next step. So I may become the next John. So, but I think it looks good, and I think it kind of reflects how we're all feeling in the moment.
Yeah.
So, for those who might watch this on the channel who don't know who you are, if you just wanted to start by telling by introducing yourself and telling us what you do at SUU, and maybe also a little bit about your books.
Okay. So I'm a professor in the English department, and I've been here since at SEU since 2001, if you can believe it. That's just crazy to me now. I came here with no kid, and next fall my daughter's going to be a T-bird.
That's
So
nuts.
we're kind of on the generational shift or the great sine wave of transition or whatever. I teach all kinds of things in the English department, but the big areas of focus for me right now are creative writing, particularly our contemporary literature for creative writing classes, which I'm calling like the literature of right now. We usually do like books that are within the last 2 to 3 years,
Mhm.
which is so much different than the rest of literary history. And then I teach a lot in our screen studies and film program. I teach film theory and screen aesthetics and classes like that. And hopefully we'll be offering a screenwriting class pretty soon when we get to the point of being able to add new stuff. So that's kind of what I do. And the work that I do to support my teaching is fiction writing. Or I guess the teaching that supports my other work is fiction writing. I'm about to have my fourth book come out this January. It's called Picnic in the Ruins. It's a little bit of a crime thriller set down on the Arizona Strip. And there's a bunch of fun stuff happening with it right now, but they're like, have me embargoed. I can't talk about it in any detail. Like they have some cover stuff and blurbs and everything, but that'll be coming out soon. But it's really fun. We're right in the middle of productions. I'm reading page proofs right now, and kind of that's where we are with that.
That's really exciting. And you said January was the release date?
Yes, that January is the release date, and all of that's within quotation marks these days.
Right.
They do their best to stay on target, but they said about every 72 hours they relearn how to do business in the COVID-19 world. So it is really, really interesting to see how even stuff like this, digital
Mhm.
events and digital connections, are becoming a lot more about how books are introduced into the world, where it used to be based on kind of live events in bookstores. A lot of it's changing this way.
Mhm.
And they're finding they're reaching all kinds of people they never thought they could reach before. So publishing's having a really interesting relationship right now with these kinds of things that we're doing here and stuff that SU community, like the community reads program, has done.
Right.
It's kind of cool. Plus, we get to see everybody's beige walls.
Yes. Yes. The beige is due for a comeback, I feel like. So yeah. So way to sport those beige walls. Um, and I know you did one of these for the as kind of like a community outreach event. Well, you've done a couple, and then I was able to see the one where you kind of talked a little bit more about your most recent published book, which was It Needs to Look Like We Tried, which is
Hmm.
fabulous. And since you spent some time talking about that, I thought what we'd do here is maybe go a little bit into how I guess a little bit about your process of writing, right? So are
Yeah.
you somebody who starts with like a fully fleshed idea and just gets it out on the page, or is
Out Picnic in the Ruins, it's a crime novel, so it's really plot intensive. And I found that my process had to be really a lot more intentional. When you build a crime and you've got a mystery and you've got a whole bunch of things that need to make sense, like an elaborate Rube Goldberg machine like this, it gotta go click, 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 clunk, clunk, boom.
right?
And that's what's sort of beautiful and wonderful about a mystery or a crime novel, is that it has those expectations. And so you have to build all that inner working. And that is where I was like drawing diagrams, and I had like a crazy wall like they do in cop shows. Like I had Post-its all up and like things running between them because I needed a way to visualize the ecosystem of the story.
Right.
While I'm kind of between drafts coming back to me through the editorial process, I realized that I couldn't put my head into another, and I have a project plan to do another crime novel, who like an Agatha Christie whodunit style. But I realized I didn't have the bandwidth for that right now. And so I'm turning to a project I've been thinking about a lot that's kind of emerging organically. And so I find myself switching into that mode. And so what I'm doing right now is just sort of, I say, I'm going to write one vignette a day. I don't start out knowing anything other than the vignette that I want to write. And so it's more in the creative nonfiction. It's a memoir of the time that I spent working in the summer camping business for the YMCA from like 1985 to 1994 in that span. And so that project is lending itself more to, well, just like last night, the thing that I wrote was in response to a friend that I used to work with up at these facilities. She lives down in LA, and she went to the beach for the first time. And she was talking about how glorious it was to experience the beach. It was late in the evening, nobody was there. And so I started thinking about sometimes that she and I and our friend Alan would be out on a boat in the Puget Sound. And I said, oh, tonight I'll write about that. And so I wrote 700 words of that vignette and let it expand to just fill the space for the time to write. What is kind of nice is I'm not on contract with that. And I was on contract with the other book. So I had to like have something. It wasn't just like, I'll wait till the muses settle in. Like the primary muse was the contract that's sitting in a file in New York City that says you're going to get done or you're in trouble. This other project isn't on contract. And so I feel like I can take that kind of lazy river and just let it pull me where it is. And I kind of have to say, maybe spiritually, I love the lazy river approach. Just kind of write, fall into the lyricism, kitty tail. Fall into the lyricism of it. Let the writing pull me where it needs to pull me. And I've really loved it. My light just went out, so I better. This other thing that was really plot intensive, and that took a different part of my brain. In some cases, it was a little bit, like doing math problems. Like you have to make the equation balance, and you have to make sure you didn't forget things. And you had to make sure that, oh, did I actually move that person to this geographical location in order to see this thing? So there's a lot of parts moving, and it feels like clockwork a little bit more. Or what do they call those things? The models of the solar system that go around, orrery. Yeah. So it felt like kind of putting one of those things together because it all has to kind of move this way. Each of those two modes is a different kind of delightful and its own kind of frustration. Like tonight, all I'm committed to is 700 more words of something. And so I would be lying if I wasn't a little concerned of like, what's it going to be tonight? And will it be as enjoyable to write as last night, or will I suffer? Or any of those kinds of things. But basically, I'll just wait till the house gets quiet and then try to occupy that space and see how the writing can engage my memory, and we'll go. And then when I slip back into finding misplaced smart quotes and bad commas, and whether or not I've capitalized Secretary of the Interior correctly or whatever, that's the other part of my creative process right now, is all the dots and I's and jots and tittles of the other project. So I think it's a good balance, freedom and that kind of specific follow through work to get that book ready to go to print.
Yeah. So and kind of like speaking to that a little bit, do you find yourself, like as a writer, do you find yourself like more naturally drawn to like short stories and shorter formats versus the novel? And is that the same for you, like as a reader?
Oh man, that is a really great question for me right now, because I feel like I'm in transition. My dissertation was an exploration of the kind of Venn overlap
Mhm.
between prose poem and flash fiction.
Mhm.
And so how these very short forms in prose would work, and that would be, and really it played with the idea between lyricism and narrativity, and then sometimes where they overlapped. And so that was where I dedicated a lot of my intellectual space. And then I did a short story collection. And then the industry said what the industry often says: cool, cool stories, Todd. How about a novel?
Right.
And so then I kind of moved through the different spaces. I did a novel for a regional press that's kind of set in Utah. That was really, it's chronological and kind of straightforward. And then that was upsetting to me in a certain way because I wanted to be free, even
Mhm.
though I liked that book. So I went back, and the first book that I did that came out in 2018 that I did with Counterpoint was, we called it various things, but my Brian Evanson, my old dissertation director, gave me the term a mosaic novel, which is
Mhm.
better, I think, than a novel and stories. But it wasn't a non-narrative mosaic novel. It was this novel that was kind of plugged in, and each chapter was an independent story. But as you read along, you learned that there was a bunch of interdependence. So by the end of the book, you're like, whoa, it's actually a novel. But at the beginning of the book, you feel like it's a short story collection, and then sort of
Mhm.
somewhere in the middle there's a crossfade. And so I experimented with form with that one. And then this one, I think, is a kind of a what I've been calling a convergence narrative. So there's a story and a story and a story, and they all kind of meet at one time and place,
Right.
and then those stories braid together and move along. And so in each of those ways, I think what I'm trying to do is explore stretching shortness into longness.
Right.
But some of the things that I love to read the most, like Jenny Offal's Department of Speculation, are these books that kind of work in fragments. They're like
Mhm.
long, kind of rhythmic bundles of fragments. Italo Calvino has written that way before, like with
Mhm.
Invisible Cities. I'm really fascinated with that form, and one of these days I'd kind of like to do a whole book that kind of functions in that cohesive fragments
Right.
story. But I'll let them get a little bit more comfortable with me and find out how many things I can sell before I say I want to do this really weird experimental thing.
Right.
um, but I feel like I'm trapped between shortness and longness. Like, I
Mm.
love uh, what television is doing these days, and that
Mhm.
it is both episodic
Mhm.
and like epic in its scale. When you talk about shows that are running for 5 or 6 seasons, the narrative complexity of that is amazing. But they also have to be able to tell a story within like 40 minutes that
Right.
feels self-contained and has its own beats.
Mhm.
And then the season has to have its own beats, and then the whole series has to have its own beats. I guess I went out of the frame, like, and so that you see at each one of those scales a way that narrative works.
Right.
And I think that kind of stuff happens like with poetry too, right?
Mhm.
like like if you like Walt Whitman, he has these amazing things he does with the line, and then with the poem, and then with a whole endeavor like Leaves of Grass.
Mhm.
So that's that weird space that I'm in. um, but I have to sort of take it, like Annie Lamott says, bird by bird when
Mhm.
I'm writing, and just be like, well, what can I do today that will feel like good work, and how can I set myself to wake up tomorrow, and with all the things that are in front of me tomorrow, how can I be like, I am very interested in going and playing make believe with this stuff some more tomorrow, as opposed to, I've damaged it beyond repair. I know I no longer want to write this thing. I want to hide from it. I guess I'd be lying if I said that never happened, because sometimes I just, don't want to. But I think that's the trick. The trick between a writer and someone who writes is the writer writes anyway.
Mhm.
And I know it sounds so bad. It's like a sports analogy, like no pain, no gain.
Right.
Um, but I really feel like that's the deal.
Yeah.
So you can only write in short spurts, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you can only go so long before it starts to unravel. And so I feel like that's always the novelist's concern, even the short story writer's concern, is there's only so long we can focus our attention and write today.
Right.
And we have to either come back to it or be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how it's kind of works for me.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, and it kind of resonates with something I like to tell my students, which is like, half of succeeding in college is just showing up, right? And which kind of leads me to my next question, which is maybe how your writing has informed your teaching, or vice versa.
Oh, I have a good quick answer for that, and then I think I have one that's simmering a little bit.
Okay.
I used to be like, you need to, if you're writing and you're going to turn something in, you need to be like on top of it and like never mess anything up. When I get back page proofs now, and I think, I've been through this. I'm a super smart editor, Jenny Alton, has been through this. A copy editor has been through this, and I'm going through this again, and there's still an error. I'm so much more merciful now. Just because I get the process, I'm like, oh man, it takes so many systems to get something perfect. And I think when I was young and teaching, I really wanted those students to be like, you show them that you care by getting this right. And now I'm like, that's really not the spirit of it. Which is why I get what my dissertation director said. You get one error per page. Anything more than that, then people start looking at you funny.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay. So that's really, I'm much more now interested in process for my students because of being in this thing that we call a professional process, right? This isn't just me talking. This is about me recognizing and participating in this editorial process at the national level. And I'm like, oh, okay, if this is how these people do it, I mean, there are so many errors in the like typos and stuff in the emails that go back professionally. And I used to be like copy editing, like printing and like fixing my emails. And I've just relaxed that a little bit so that we can move more to content. So that's like one like surface thing. The other thing that is starting to emerge from my participation in literary culture right now is what I'm able to say back to students who have aspirations to participate in literary culture. And there's absolutely, I don't even know what the right word for it is. There's a groundswell conversation going on in literary Twitter right now about the ways in which people of color and women get paid in their advances versus the way that men, particularly white men, particularly straight cisgendered males get paid. And so there's been this kind of disclosure of advances, and it's creating crazy feelings. They're asking for transparency. People are transparency and share some of these things, and then they get dragged on Twitter. And so some people are like, hey man, you can't ask people to like share stuff and then do this to them. And they're like, well, they need to quit whining. And so there's this whole thing that's blowing up over how people get paid. There's also another kind of groundswell movement where some beloved writers like J.K. Rowling has said some things about transgender people that has caused some real concern. And so is this part of cancel culture, or is this part of something bigger? And so I have been on the periphery of those kinds of conversations, but now they're really kind of central to what my marketing and publicity team wants me to do. I'm like, I would just stay off Twitter. And they're like, you can't now. You have to participate in that and be a citizen. And I'm like, well, what do I do? And so lately, with Black Lives Matter, with these other concerns that are coming with the publishing paid me hashtag, with some of these other things, with the concerns that came up about cultural appropriation in American dirt, there are so many important things that our students need to consider about what it means to participate in literary culture. And what does it mean to participate in literary culture when you come from a position of privilege, like I do? I'm certainly not one of these people who got $800,000 advance, like some people are disclosing, or even I'm not playing in a world where that kind of money is coming around, but some people do. And I think students maybe have aspirationally that idea that they could be that person. And does a $200,000 advance for a literary debut happen? Yes, but almost never.
Right.
But we also have to start thinking that publishing is going through this identity crisis where they're like, should we be paying these sums at all as advances? Because it is a form of indenture. You're paid in advance. Your book has to pay that back. I mean, it's not free money. And so I never had these real practical, almost kind of like Marxist ideas about what are the means of production and how do books come to exist. And so last year when I taught contemporary literature, that was a mainstay of what we talked about. How do books get into play? What are the things that happen? What happens when there's a dust up, like with American Dirt? It certainly didn't hurt the sales of American Dirt, by the way.
Right.
But what space do they want to exist in, and what's different in the markets? Many of our students want to be in the YA market. Well, I'll tell you what, that's where the money is. And where the money is also where it is the most sinister and cutthroat, really, in a lot of ways, because of those resources that people are going after. So now I want to say, okay, I know you love the idea of YA fantasy. Are you ready to go into that roller derby? Or, you
Right.
know, or death ball or whatever it is,
Yeah.
because it's pretty intense.
Hmm.
And I don't think there's anything that we could do in the classroom that would duplicate the intensity. Like, I don't think I could do a thing where let's all get on Twitter and I'm going to drag each one of you so that you know what it feels like, so that you're ready to do that when you enter the public sphere. But I do want them to be aware that this kind of thing happens. And this might be why some of their favorite authors withdraw from social media. And then again, we would look at J.K. Rowling and say, hey, you make a statement on Twitter, it could have massive implications on how your work is canceled. So a lot of it is not just writing and not just craft, but this
Hmm.
sense that publishing is a business, and it would be foolish and naive for us as teachers to ignore the fact that publishing puts you in an economic exchange. So we have to start thinking about all the other economic exchange things.
Right.
And at the same time say, but you're an artist, so do what's true. Because that's the other thing. Anybody who tries to zero in on the market and like lead and try to skate to where the market's going, they always mess up. Like, it just doesn't happen. And so a lot of it's just gambling. And so I say, since it is, you just have to be true to yourself. Do the thing that feels right, and then find someone out there who can be your champion,
Right.
because that's what it takes. You just have to find someone who wants to go into this fray and say, I have a book that's so good, I'm going to spend my time fighting for it. And the only way that that happens is write a book that you like. If you knew that you were going to leave this planet, I don't say die because it scares everybody. I say, like, get picked up by a UFO. If you knew in 3 years a UFO is going to take you somewhere through hyperspace, whatever, what book would you write and leave behind?
Right.
And then try to say, that's what your next project should be. You should feel like, I have to write this before the aliens take me.
That's a great way of looking at it. And I think that actually brings up something else that I'm kind of curious about, because you had mentioned kind of like existing in this movement, especially with you know so much happening and such a powerful resurgence in like the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of related movements, right? So we're kind of in this strange like period in 2020 where like it's like one crisis after another, and there's a lot of upheaval. And so my question is, where you see writing in that, both as someone who creates and as someone who who reads, how can that kind of provide some solace or some consolation or comfort, or even some guidance or direction when things are so uncertain?
I would say, let me go with something we've been talking about in our family for the last little while. You know, the guy who writes those kids books, Mo Willems,
Yes, yes,
like the pigeon books or whatever.
yeah.
My wife came across something that he said, and I think it may have been like on Jimmy Fallon or something like that. I think it was because he was teaching Jimmy an art lesson. And that one of the things he said, uh, science is going to get us past this pandemic,
Mhm.
but art is going to get us through it, or some version of something like that. So I guess I would start with that premise.
Hmm.
that it's like, we've kind of, for a while maybe, particularly in education, but also in commerce, maybe in politics, thought about art as this pleasant little thing, but it's over here.
Hmm.
And what I think people are realizing is that when they need solace, when they need to process complex emotional feelings of anxiety and neurosis and whatever, art
Hmm.
is one of the things that can solve it. And it doesn't matter whether it's like some beautiful music to just kind of help us kind of figure things out, or whether it's some kind of music like Rage Against the Machine that helps us voice, you know, amazing concerns. Or every now and then I've been tuning in to, Questlove, like from the Roots.
Yeah.
Questlove, Questlove has been like DJing on Twitter in the evenings. And so when we get done, I'm going to like go turn on Questlove, because he actually does these amazing sets where he's like putting together some stuff that really speaks or reflects kind of some of what he's thinking about. And so what I've been trying to do a lot is listen to some of these voices that are speaking now. And some of them are speaking through protest, and some of them are speaking through their writing and their art.
Hmm.
Some, like Questlove, are speaking it by assembling these amazing tunes, and offering some of his own commentary and reflection on the day. And just say, it's maybe what I can do to gain the most solace or understanding is to listen more, to read more, to absorb more in, to listen to indigenous voices, to listen to Black voices, people of color, women, when they speak and when they write, so that I can start to formulate some of my own thinking. Because I think it's really easy to go from my position of privilege, well, I'm experiencing X, so that's all there is. And I think that the very first move that we can all make is to recognize, oh man, there's so many other things that are going on. And
Hmm.
then sometimes when it's uncomfortable, to sit with that,
Right.
and let that process. And I found a lot more peace in that. But that's one way to set one set of troubles. Another thing I did that was really weird, I started a book called The Dog Stars,
Hmm.
just about a week ago. It's by Peter Heller. Have you heard of this before? It's it's a post-apocalyptic book about a guy he's a pilot, and he lives
Hmm.
up in Colorado. And it's really almost like a post-apocalyptic, um, like Outside magazine article about like hunting and fishing.
Yeah.
And I can't, I'm not a fisherman, I'm not a hunter. I, that, but for some reason it's offering me so much solace, and
Yeah.
it's so unexpected to be like, oh, there's this really weird, peaceful, punctuated by these absolute moments of terror and
Hmm.
sadness book. And when I told my daughter what I was reading, she's 17, she said, why would you read that now? And I said, I can't explain it, but it's making me peace. But I've also been reading Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius
Uh-huh.
and some of these other things, to just try to use some of that to kind of bring the anxiety down. Marcus Aurelius is so great about like stare the stuff that is going on, like your worst possible case scenario, just stare it down, figure
Hmm.
out if you can live it, and then move on. And so I wouldn't have expected a person like myself, who really quite likes, horror and science fiction and whatever, to find this solace in hunting and fishing books and Marcus Aurelius, but that's where it's happening. So
Yeah.
I'm letting that. So it's a combination, right, between like Questlove's sets, reading some amazing work as I'm getting ready for my contemporary literature class from people of color,
Hmm.
particularly women of color, um, and all these different perspectives. So I'm just kind of letting that dance around, and I'm trying to read against the grain. Like there's some things that I normally would go to, um, and I'm trying to say, nope, save that for later. Move into new spaces. And a lot of that's because I'm getting so comfortable with my own home, like maybe overly comfortable, like house arrest level of comfort.
Right.
And so these other views and perspectives are like these different windows, like in the Sanctum Sanctorum and Doctor Strange, right? Like I can go
Yeah.
look into these other places through these other voices, and that helps, also because we're Southern Utah, right? It's an isolated kind of place in some ways. Um, and so um, I think that we have to be really intentional when we live here to make sure that we are getting other perspectives at
Right.
play. Was there, did I see a question flash?
Yeah, there.
Uh,
So how Chris mentions that some intellectual tourism can get you out of your own bubble. So kind of, sounds like what you were talking about in terms of it, intentionally encountering new voices and
mhm.
ideas and using that as a kind of a doorway to better understanding where you're at.
Yeah, I think it's a good starting place. I think what we can, I have made the mistake before of suggesting that this is like curiosity. And I
Mhm.
think it's much more important than curiosity. I think it's, we have an obligation to understand one another
Yeah.
and to do that with the best means that we have in front of ourselves to do that. So that we can be better neighbors and friends and care for others. And so I think where Chris's comment came from, I think it's a great start. But what I get cautious about is suggesting that you can kind of hit a buffet of other ideas and like fill your plate and go, oh, this is really nice, and then go back to your thing.
Right.
My hope is with these encounters is to have my perspective change and to remold it. And
Mhm.
it's not always comfortable. And
Right.
and that's, you asked an earlier question about my classes. A lot of times my students come to me as readers who enjoy reading for the purpose of escape. And I think, you know what, that's great. That Dog Stars book, that's exactly what it is for me. But some reading, I think, needs to be for us as self-improvement.
Right.
And to avoid the kind of Northanger Abbey problem, right? Where it's, if you keep reading those novels, it'll rot your brain. Um, I think that there's some portion of what we can use the empathetic power of literature to do is to
Mhm.
change ourselves, expand ourselves, and to learn and listen
Right.
to what these other voices have to say. And that's where I think people have to be intentional. It's easy to fall into your grooves about what you want to read unless you're saying, I need to find out what these voices are. I need to read these voices, and I need to think very, very deeply about what all these other perspectives are. And that takes work.
So I'm getting the 5 minute warning from Zoom before it kicks us off. So I did want to just ask you to uh, tell us briefly the titles of the books that you have written. And I'm asking because I know for a fact that we have all of them at the library. So that way those who are curious and haven't read your work have an opportunity to check those out at some point.
That's fantastic. And I don't know, are they still doing that cool thing where you like can like send in what you want and then some amazing uh, library angel comes and just hands it to you? I had that experience earlier this summer, and I go, this is delightful. It's like a drive-through window for books.
Yes, that is currently the case. We will be, as restrictions loosen, the library will be opening up. It'll be the first floor to begin with, but that'll be happening here soon.
So to your question, the first book that I had was a collection of short stories and novella called Long After Dark. That was done with this a regional press, Zarahemla Books. And my dissertation director, Brian Evanson, wrote the intro for that. It was pretty cool. I pulled those stories for my dissertation, some of them, and did that on his recommendation to put that book together. So it was cool to see that come out. And that was followed out by a book that's set in Sanpete County, um, called Rift. That's really just about how the tensions in small towns. I kind of pitched it a little bit as grumpy old men in Utah, which is a little bit redundant. But it was also my first step towards kind of writing comedic, kind of regional comedic stuff. Then Counterpoint Press in 2018 released this Mosaic novel, It Needs to Look Like We Tried, which was really fun to put out and to do with them. And then the follow-up book is Picnic in the Ruins, which my publicist said, imagine the Coen brothers in a national park. And that really was like my favorite thing anybody's maybe ever said about my writing. And that's set to be out early January of 2021. And yeah, it's exploring a little bit of this idea of what's a national park, what are the politics of a park, what are museums, and what is provenance, and should we be leaving stuff that we find out in the wild, cultural artifacts, should we leave them where they lay, should we be bringing them in, and then what is kind of the um, what kind of cultural appropriation happens when
Right.
the only thing that's important to us about a people is their stuff. And so
Mhm.
it's a little bit of by using satire and some humor, it's trying to look at maybe we've made some mistakes in how we address Indigenous people, the things that they've left behind, the way that we interpret and kind of override their stories. But it's also a crime novel, and it's also a little bit gross and a little bit. I was hoping to. I didn't want to write an anthropological text on it. I really wanted to write a novel and see if people could engage those ideas through the idea of the novel.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Todd. I really appreciate that.
Thanks for having me, Chris. The library does really cool things, you know. As I tease some of my librarians, there are books at the library, but there's also some other cool stuff that's happening with our libraries too.
Exactly.